All right, let's talk about functions in JavaScript. This will just kind of be an intro, and then we'll do some more videos with examples. But really, functions are really important in coding, because functions, what they allow us to do is they allow us to break up our code into these smaller parts, and then we can reuse these smaller parts of work. So kind of allows us to break them up and reuse our code. So let's just look at how we write a function in JavaScript. So with JavaScript, we use the keyword function, and then we give it, a name. So let's say we're doing like an add function. I want to add 2 numbers. I would call this add. Now, what I can do is I can give it some parameters. So I'm going to call it just param1 and param2 for now. And then in my function here, I can do some work. So with this add function, I can just go ahead and return param1 plus param2. Now, we'll talk about what this return is. What this is going to do, this is going to return this result. Now, this right here, this whole section, this would be referred to as a function definition. I'm defining, I am defining an add function. All right. So now I can come run this node demo.js. Nothing happens. It's important to note that defining a function doesn't really call it. It doesn't do anything. This is kind of like a blueprint of how to do add, because what's param1 and param2, you can kind of think of these as local variables to this function. I actually need to do the second part, which is invoke or, call the function. So to do that, I can come down here. I say add. I use my parentheses. Now this add function, I need to give it actual numbers here. So I can do 1 and 1. Now up here where I define this function, it returns this value. So you can think of when I call it with 1 and 1, these are now what are called arguments. So I'm passing the add function arguments, which are going to be 1 and 1. You can kind of think of these then becoming those params 1 and 2. So this would become 1 and 1, and that's what it returns. So now I can store this to a variable. Let's sum 1 equal that, and then I can do a console.log sum 1. And then we got 2. Now, so I define my function once, but I can invoke it many times. That's the, this whole point. We can reuse this. So then I can do like sum 2. And now I can give it different numbers. Like, let's say we want to add 2 and 10. I think this is any surprise that this is going to be 12. So this is the basic syntax of the function declaration, and then I call the function. So let's just review some of these terms. I think these are kind of important to know. So function definition, when we define a function, we use the keyword function, we give it a name, and like with variables, we want to be descriptive with our names. So this function is adding 2 numbers, so I call it add. I could call it x, and that would work. I'd have to call it x down there when I invoke it, but x would be a bad name. It's kind of unclear, it's ambiguous, so I'll call it add. Switch that back. The next part we have is parameters. So parameters, you can kind of think of these, they're not quite variables, but they're kind of these things we can eventually, someone like with an add function, someone's going to want to actually pass us values. So when we define our function, we can define these parameters, and then we can use those values in our function. So it's the way we can take values that's given to us when someone calls it and then use it in our function. Now, like with our function name, I should maybe be a little more descriptive and call these something else. I probably, because really what I expect these to be are numbers. So I could call this num1 and num2. And then I would have to change the name there to num1 and num2. And just to kind of just, make sure this is clear, let's just do a log num1, and then I'll do num2. All right, so when I run this, see the first time I run it, num1 is 1 because it's going to correspond to the first argument. And then num2 is going to be 1 again. That's going to be the second argument. But when I call my add function with different arguments, the num1 becomes 2, the num2 becomes 10. So I can pass different values to this function, but I can reuse these values in my function definition. Something else we see is this return keyword. So functions return, what you're generally going to see is functions do some work and then they return a value. In this case, I'm returning the sum. If I don't have this return keyword and say I just did I just here console.log num1 plus num2, I would log it here, but then my sum1, this is going to be undefined by default. Let me just put a message here so it's a little more clear. And that as well. So if I don't return anything in a function, it's going to, by default, run the function. It's going to do all of the work. See, it's logging these two numbers, and then it even logs the sum. But at the end, notice my sum1, I'm setting it equal to this add function, is undefined. So we've done a lot of console.logs. Console.logs are really debugging tools. They're not really functional other than that. What we generally do with functions is we're going to return a value. So here I don't want to log num1 plus num2. I want to return the sum. And now those are defined. I'm also going to get rid of these logs. So I return a value, it returns the addition. I can return anything. I could return a string. If I return yo, then my add function now just returns the string yo, which is not really useful, but we do that. Like I said, if I don't return anything, by default, it's going to return undefined. So that's the return keyword. Something else to notice with the return keyword is once a function hits a return statement, it stops the call. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's just say for some reason, number1 cannot be 10. We just don't want to add 10. So here I can say return a string num1 cannot be 10. So a function can only return one thing, but I could have multiple returns. Just also, let's do a console.log here just to show this. So if my number1 is 10, let's do equal 10. So if number1 is equal to 10, I'm going to hit this if statement, and then my function will return. So I will not get here. So let's make another call here. Let's sum 3, and then for that first argument, I'm going to have that be 10. And then we'll log it here. So let's run this. So as we see, I can add 1 and 1, that is 2. And notice we're getting that log here, and then log 2. Once again, with this second one, we can add 2 and 10 because I'm only checking to see if this first thing is 10. So this adds to 12. But once we get here, when my first argument is 10, that's going to hit that block. And then number 1 cannot be 10. And notice here, we do not log the here. So that's our return keyword. We can have multiple returns in our function, but once we hit a return, the function stops. So we will not get there. I could also show this by saying, hey, like return 1. So notice if I have this return 1, see VS Code is graying out this code down here, and it's going to give me a unreachable code detected because this function would just always return 1. All right. We have this other, so looking at more terminology, invoking or calling a function. So here we are invoking the function. We give it the name and then we use the parentheses. I can do something like this in JavaScript. Let me delete these so it's a little more clear. I can say like let x equal add. And then I can do a console.log x. So here I'm not actually calling the function. I'm just creating another variable and I'm setting it equal to x. I can actually now, x is just an alias for my add function. I could technically call it right there. That's a little more advanced. So to call a function, I need to use the parentheses. And so this actually calls it, well, now this returns, this isn't returning anything because I'm just doing, undefined plus undefined. So with our add function, remember, we can call it, but we actually need to pass it some parameters. Save that. And let's see here. I need to save that. Oh, I need to console.log x. And there we go, there's 5. So once again, if I don't pass it parameters, that will give me nan because I'm doing undefined plus undefined, which is nan. But it still calls the function. And to show this, I could do a console.log add called. So without the parentheses, it just is going to set this variable x to the add function. It's not going to invoke it. But when I use the parentheses and I run this, see, it says add called. But once again, I need to pass this some parameters. Another thing that we'll see with functions is this concept of scope. So I can come here and in my function, and I can declare a variable inside of here. Let's, let's just call this is even. So I could maybe down here, I could declare a variable called is even. Let's just see like num1. And this is going to be, hey, does num1 mod 2 equal 0. And then we could say like console.log is even. So I can declare a variable in my add function. So let's make that first one even. So 2 is even. So when I log that, I could say, number 1 is even. Could do it with some string interpolation. Let's do this. Num1 is, and then I can go ahead and interpolate this just to give this a little more clear message. So I could say 2 is even, question mark, and then I'll say true. 2 is even, yes it is. If I switch this to 3, is 3 even? No, it's not. So, but the point here is I can have variables in my function, but if I try to log is even outside of my function, I get an error. This is not defined. So this, when we're talking about scope, it's this idea of where these variables are visible. So I would say that this way, is even is scoped to my add function. So I can use it in my add function, but I can't use it outside of my function. If I had, you know, some var defined outside of here, like let's call this let's just call it foo equals hello. So if I have a variable scoped outside of the function, I can use that in my function. And I won't get an error. Oh, again, I need to get rid of that one because that's undefined. So let's comment that out. So here I define a variable foo outside of my function, and now I can use it in there. There we go. So foo is scoped to my file and to my function. This is even variable is only scoped to my function. I can't use it outside of that. So there are some of the basics of functions. I'll stop it here. I'll do another. Functions are definitely a more complicated subject, something that even today I'm still learning more and more about how to better use functions. JavaScript is a very functional programming language. So we'll stop it here and we'll look at some examples in another video.